It's my pleasure to introduce the hydrogen panel. We have on our panel today Ravi Prasher, the Chief Technology Officer of Bloom Energy, Neil Navin, Senior Vice President at Sempra SoCalGas, and Darren Rice, General Manager of Hydrogen Strategy and Market Insights at Chevron New Energies. Our moderator for this session is Blanca Begert, how to pronounce it? Begert at Politico.
Is this on? Okay, yes. So hi, everyone. Thank you all for being here for the Hydrogen Hour. I'm Blanca Begert, California climate reporter with Politico. If you don't know the Politico California Climate Newsletter, it's a newsletter focused on climate policy and politics in the state. It's free, it's daily. I work on it with a team of reporters, and it's a must read if I say so myself. So you can Google it and find it. So with that, on to hydrogen. So just a very quick primer, because I know we want to hear from our panelists. Hydrogen, is a fuel that emits no carbon when burned or used in a fuel cell. The Biden administration has made it a key part of its climate strategy, especially for reducing emissions from hard to electrify sectors like steel production and, long-haul marine shipping, for example. Right now, nearly all the hydrogen that's made is stripped from natural gas in a carbon-intensive process that's mostly used, that hydrogen is mostly used in refining, fertilizer, and chemical production. But there are billions of dollars of government incentives ramping up to make lower carbon hydrogen and create a market from it. So we're gonna get into all that, but it's a very new industry, really in its infancy when you think of what's being built now and the targets the government has set. So here today we have 3 hydrogen experts to talk about what's going on with the fuel and where they see it going. Darren Rice, General Manager for on the far end. Neil Navin, Chief Clean Fuels Officer for SoCal Gas Company. Then Darren Rice, General Manager for Hydrogen Strategy with Chevron. And Ravi Prasher, CTO of Bloom Energy, which makes electrolyzers for producing hydrogen and fuel cells that can run on it. So I'd love to just start with asking everyone to please introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your work as it relates to hydrogen. And if you could also just touch on how important hydrogen is relative to, the broader mix of products your company makes and delivers, that would be interesting as well. So we can start with you, Neil.
Yeah, thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. So SoCalGas is the largest natural gas distribution company in the Western Hemisphere. We serve roughly 1 in 15 Americans. We have about 160-year history in the state, but I think interestingly, we have only delivered natural gas as a product to our customers for about half that time. Before we delivered natural gas to our customers, we delivered something called town gas, which actually had a significant amount of hydrogen in it. What SoCalGas did very consciously about 4 years ago was to align our business strategy with the goals of the state, and that is to lower carbon over time. And one of those key avenues is looking at hydrogen, so delivering hydrogen to decarbonize the hard to electrify parts of the economy, things like heavy-duty transportation, industry, but also dispatchable electric generation, which is something we can certainly talk about. And those policies of the state that incentivize those tools, because it is a tool, along with many others, are really important to the gas company, along with things like biogas, renewable natural gas, carbon capture, and fuel cells. So I'm happy to be here today.
Cool, thanks. And Darren?
Yeah, Darren Rice. To introduce myself, I'll date myself a little bit. So 24 years ago, I got my first superintendent job, and it happened to be in a refinery, overseeing parts of the refinery, which included a hydrogen plant, a methane steam reforming plant. So that was a long time ago. The last 3 years, I've been general manager of strategy for Chevron New Energies. And I will say, you would think they'd be kind of related, but they're absolutely, I think my first supervisory job did really nothing to prepare me for kind of what we've experienced over the last 3 years. So strategy GM for Chevron New Energies. So Chevron, I'd say 3 years ago, we actually started a startup within a parent company, which I'll say once again is Chevron New Energies. We focused on 3 different segments. One was carbon capture, another one was offsets, and the business line that I'm associated is with hydrogen. And so it's been a great journey over the last 3 years, I would say, when it comes to our company and how we view hydrogen. My belief is it's going to be a profitable business. When it'll be profitable is a bit of, the big question. But with that said, super convinced that hydrogen has a specific role to play in the hardest to abate sectors. And in trying to get to net zero, it's a critical molecule that will help us get to net zero at the lowest cost to society. And so we believe in energies needed for modern life, and we absolutely are resolute on believing in a lower carbon future. Just to kind of bookend that a little bit, when we started up this business, we stated that we were going to invest at least $8 billion in these new businesses, of which I'd say the hydrogen business is probably going to come in somewhere between 2 and 4 billion between the time we started up in 2028. And so between all those things, just super proud to be here and super proud to be part of this transition. So thank you.
Thanks. And Ravi?
Hi, Ravi Prasher, CTO of Bloom Energy. But let me give you a little bit of broader background about me. So before I joined Bloom, I was at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab working as a senior scientist, and I was also one of the associate lab directors. So I had the fortune of working with or managing 400 scientists and engineers working on all aspects of energy transition. I consider myself very lucky that I got a big panoramic view of what was happening in the energy transitions landscape. And then I decided to join Bloom, primarily because of hydrogen, because I felt that time of hydrogen has come. And the reason I believe is that because I feel that the hydrogen community became smarter and realized that hydrogen is not only transportation fuel, it's not for running cars. Actually, it has much bigger uses, particularly in the hard to decarbonize sectors like steel, ammonia, and all those kind of sectors, or long haul transport. So that was one of the reasons that I joined Bloom as CTO, because we make both fuel cell, which can use hydrogen to make electricity, and just using the same fuel cell but reversing the process by putting electricity in and water in, you can make hydrogen, right? So that's a platform technology. That's what attracted me to Bloom. And while I'm at Bloom, I'm still an adjunct professor at UC Berkeley, where I supervise PhD students and postdocs. And in that sense, again, a lot of those guys students are working on research which is related to batteries, hydrogen, thermal energy storage. But in that sense, again, I feel that hydrogen has a very unique advantage in terms of decarbonizing many sectors which other things cannot. For example, in the prior panel, we heard long duration storage. That was one of the things came across quite a bit. One of the ideas is that maybe potentially someday when hydrogen is very, very cheap, you can even do seasonal storage. And if you do even in California, for example, there are times in Bay Area in November, December timeframe, there is no sun. I mean, it's almost cloudy, almost throughout the day, right? So you will need long duration storage, and hydrogen can play a very key role even there as well. And so I'm happy to be here and share my thoughts where I think the field is going.
Cool, thank you. Okay, well, that's great. Thanks, all. So I want to start with a question about the business of producing low carbon hydrogen. So there's two methods that, and there's more than this, but that are really getting attention. Green hydrogen, which is made through splitting hydrogen from water using electricity, and that can be zero carbon if, and that's a big if, the electricity comes from renewable sources. There's blue hydrogen, which captures the carbon from hydrogen made with natural gas. And depending on studies, some look at it in practice that it can reduce emissions from that process from 10 to 70%, and there's projections that are more optimistic that it could do more. And there's a couple other kinds of low carbon production methods, but recent reporting shows that there's really some headwinds against these lower carbon fuels. Less than 12% of low carbon hydrogen projects planned for the end of the decade have interested buyers. Some of those are in the very early stages and could get canceled. And green hydrogen faces particular challenges with spiking costs, which could make it prohibitively expensive and hard to compete with natural gas. So I want to ask, and I'll start with Darren because I know Chevron makes gray hydrogen but has plans in the works for blue and green. Is there a path forward for green hydrogen, or should businesses plan to focus more on other hydrogen types like blue or pink or any of the others? Or
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, thank you for that question. You guys help me out. I'll start here. So let me frame, if you don't mind, let me frame your question a little bit, right? So Neil and I were both part of a study, National Petroleum Council study that we just issued to the Department of Energy that said, Secretary Granholm said, well, please tell me what it takes to scale hydrogen, right? So the first thing I'd say is, you talk about policy and policy enabled, and you need to have policy in order for this economy to work. I'm not an economist, so I'll say I haven't always understood what that really means. But let me frame it for you in that the cost to produce low carbon intensity hydrogen is much more expensive than the incumbent fuels that it's trying to displace, right? And the whole reason why this business case exists is because of decarbonization goals. And my point is, without policy, you'll never close that gap. You can't technology improve your way to make the low carbon intensity molecule cheaper than the incumbent fuel. So point one. And therefore, this exists because everyone's on this journey for certain decarbonization goals, and everybody has a different pace at which they want to meet those goals and a different willingness to pay along that journey, right? So I'll answer it this way. I think that, in my view, we're on the clock, right? To get to net zero, you need to use all tools to lower emissions, whether it's electrification, whether it's carbon capture, whether it's blue hydrogen, whether it's green hydrogen. And so I would say, yeah, maybe there's this perception that green costs have gone up, but what that really means is the cost gap just doesn't work for certain customers. But I will say, different customers have different needs. And so to kind of put a pin in this, when I look at customers in Japan or Asia or Korea, right, what are their goals? Their goals are to lower their emissions of their coal-fired power plants. And so what do they want? They want a low carbon intensity hydrogen, maybe in the form of ammonia, to offset in the prompt their coal emissions. So they're more likely to have a blue pathway, and that's within their cost structure of what they want to do, right? I look at California, a very policy-enabled state, specifically LADWP. Chevron's involved in a project in Delta, Utah, in which the goals and objectives and the willingness to pay for LADWP actually supports green hydrogen. So my point is, especially now, between now and 2030, you're on this journey where it depends on what the customer wants and what the customer is willing to pay. Eventually, when you get towards 2050, the shift to the lowest carbon intensity molecule will be required more often than not. But anyway, it's a long way of me saying that you need all tools and you need to deploy everything we're on the clock just to start to lower emissions.
Thanks. Ravi, I know in the electrolyzer business, I'm sure you have thoughts on this.
Yes, I think it's a very complex topic. Let's start with economics first of all, and I totally agree with him. Just to set the stage correctly, that how enormous the challenge is. Let's assume natural gas today is available for $3 a MMBTU, right? For the same energy content, the hydrogen has to cost 40 cents per kilogram. Okay, this is based on physics. This is the amount of energy in hydrogen molecule available. You do the math, 40 cents, right? Let's do that again. I'm a professor, so I go back to basic physics. If you do electrolysis, okay, just breaking hydrogen, H2O molecule, you have to make hydrogen and oxygen. Let's say you take low temperature electrolysis, okay? So you assume that roughly you require 40 kilowatt hour of energy per kilogram of hydrogen, right? Basic physics. No technology here yet. That means even at 1 cent cost of electricity, 1 cent, that is already 40 cents, okay? Just in breaking that water molecule into hydrogen and oxygen. So I totally agree that it's not possible to compete with natural gas at $3 MMBTU purely based on technology. Okay, this is the thermodynamic minimum cost that you will have to pay. So that's where I'd say, IRA came up with all these rules, which is very, very good for the hydrogen economy. But the bigger question is, why hasn't it taken off at the speed that everybody anticipated? There are multiple reasons. There's not one single reason. First of all, you have two costs. One is CapEx for the electrolyzer, and then you have the OpEx for the energy. CapEx depends a lot on how many hours a day you're going to run this electrolyzer. So if you are running green, for example, that means it will totally depend on how many hours in a day the green energy is really available. That will decide your CapEx, right? Ideally, you want it 100%, not possible anywhere, right? But the idea is through this innovation, through IRA, with the $3 per kilogram tax credit, with a lot of innovation happening in the private sector, CapEx will eventually come down. Now, the second question is, at what cost the green electricity is available to you, okay? And that is where, again, you probably heard that there's all debate going on, hourly matching, weekly matching. The rules have still not been finalized, right? But the bottom line is that what is the cost of electricity at which you're going to split that water molecule into hydrogen and oxygen? And that is pretty expensive right now, okay, most of the US. A third one, which I don't think anybody anticipated, because I also worked in Department of Energy in 2010 for 2 years. And then I was in Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. I had seen all kind of scenario analysis, what will be the EV penetration, what will be the heat pump penetration, electrification of buildings. I had not seen a single study on AI revolution, okay? Not a single study. Last year, if you now Google, you have multiple reports, all from national labs, Goldman Sachs of the world, Morgan Stanley's of the world. What is happening in last 1 year, there has been tectonic shift, is that there is a dearth of green electrons available in the country. Actually, there are dearth of electrons available in the country right now to power this AI boom. So market has shifted towards powering this AI because it's a very high margin business. And I think I heard in the last panel that data centers, they can make a lot of money. So they're willing to pay, they call it premium power. I'll give you more money because time to power is more important for them. So those are multiple factors which has happened because of which it has not taken off. Another one which I think we'll cover later on is also demand side, okay? There are no demand side incentives, as well as infrastructure, hydrogen pipeline, hydrogen storage. All those things need to be figured out before we will start seeing a hydrogen revolution. So I think that's my take on this.
Well, thank you. And Neil, I know you had some thoughts about the cost as it relates to broader reliability.
Well, we briefly touched on that, and I think the last panel talked about long-duration energy storage and the idea that, today we have access to 4-hour batteries in California. They've made an enormous impact on the energy market this summer. There's no doubt about that. But for those of you who live in California or know California, the average electric energy use in August is typically double what it is in, say, April or May. So if you can imagine an electric system that's designed for a peak day, where it's producing, say, 50 to 54 gigawatts, most of the year, that system is not performing to its full potential. So to Robbie's point, when electricity becomes less expensive, that may be your opportunity to produce hydrogen. And the other thing that the United States does, but certainly California does, is we have 3 trillion cubic feet of natural gas in the ground. That is essentially energy storage that gets shifted between seasons. And your key to part of this energy transition is to understand what is the analog for a lot of natural gas or a pile of coal at your power plant. What is the decarbonized analog to that? And I'll use just two examples of that. September 6th of 2022, state of California almost had rolling blackouts. In fact, we had significant challenges with power. A few things happened during that day. Every single backup diesel generator at any university in the state was turned on so that we could reduce power needs. The governor sent a text message to every single California to ask them to turn off their electric use. And still, we almost lost power. The state spent about $250 million on electricity that day. So the value of resiliency and reliability, what is that last megawatt worth? What is it worth to you to make sure you know that your hospital always has power? That's where I think you need to look selectively at where interseasonal storage of energy, that last molecule, decarbonized molecule, gets applied, how it gets applied, and how it gets used in the economy. It may not be a perfect analog for natural gas, but it's awfully close.
Cool. Thanks. So now I think this sort of segues into a question on sort of the end use and applications of hydrogen. So it's known as the Swiss Army knife, sometimes of decarbonization, that it can be used sort of in anything that would otherwise run on fossil fuels. The Biden administration, as we said, wants to prioritize hard to decarbonize sectors. Also, and that's in line with many experts who say that because of the economics and energy intensiveness of making green or low carbon hydrogen, it should only be used to power things solar and wind can't. So that would exclude like cars, buildings, day-to-day power generation. Some in the industry have argued for broader applications. So I want to ask you guys, what are specific areas based on investment or policy where you expect demand to grow for hydrogen? And should policy and investment cast a wider net or focus on hard to decarbonize sectors? And if the latter, what do you consider those to be? So I know you kind of started talking about this already, Neil, but
I'm happy to jump in. So in California, we generally look at the hard to decarbonize areas are things like heavy duty transportation, it's been mentioned earlier, industrial applications. So Southern California is the largest concentration of manufacturing jobs in the United States. Many people think of Hollywood when they think of California, but more middle-class people get jobs from manufacturing than anywhere else in the country. So they all need access to decarbonized and affordable, reliable energy. But then counterintuitively, LADWP, Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, which serves the campus here, their efforts both in Utah to decarbonize their Utah facility along with Chevron's support, but also their in-basin generation, they are looking at hydrogen. And it's partly because of something that was mentioned earlier on, which is it is very unlikely that we're going to get many dozens of new high voltage transmission lines into the LA Basin. 20 years ago, we sought to bring more high voltage into California, a dozen or so. We've permitted precisely one in the last 20 years. So those are the things that need to be decarbonized. And the last thing I'll mention is that, for every diesel truck that you can convert to either battery or hydrogen electric, you can remove NOx from the local air. And so Southern California is a non-attainment area per federal air quality codes. And a ton of NOx removed from the air in Southern California is worth roughly $325,000 in health benefits. These are not my numbers. These are the numbers of the local air regulator. So if you can take a few thousand tons of NOx out of the air in Southern California, you can accrue mostly to disadvantaged communities about $1 billion of health benefits every year. And that's primarily why we are looking at putting in place our hydrogen pipeline system, much like Ravi said, to start moving this hydrogen around to where it's needed.
let me just ask a follow-up on that with the like the trucks and the for example, do you see hydrogen competing there with electric trucks?
Well, recall that hydrogen trucks are electric trucks. So a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle is an electric truck. It uses hydrogen instead of lithium-ion batteries. I absolutely do. I mean, one of the challenges you have with lithium-ion heavy-duty trucks is the weight of the battery, which is well known. But then also the cost of the infrastructure, the electric infrastructure, in order to actually charge those trucks in a way that allows them to be turned around quickly and to continue their work. So I do think hydrogen in transportation has an application starting with heavy duty, but then there'll be co-benefits to allow for vehicle electrification and medium duty and maybe even light duty.
All right. Ravi, you were talking a bit about AI kind of stealing away the clean electrons. Do you see AI as sort of an end use for hydrogen, or have broader thoughts about sort of the demand side?
I think, yeah, let me I have a little bit of broader thought. So Neil touched upon the transportation, trucks and stuff. Look, if you look at the industrial sector, we saw a chart in the, one of the presentations that roughly 30% of carbon emissions is from the industrial sector. It's not because of energy. Energy is a part of it, but a lot of it is process-related emissions. If you make steel, almost 5% of emission in the world is because of the chemistry of steel making. Okay, it has nothing to do with energy. That's the chemistry of steel making. Another 5% is because of chemistry of cement making. Okay, ammonia, one of the bread and butter for making fertilizers, for farming, produces a lot of CO2 because that hydrogen comes from natural gas, right? So I would say the broader use of hydrogen is in just abating that process-related emissions. Even if you electrify all the industry, right, with you providing cheap renewable electrons to those industry, but still have to get rid of these processes. That's where hydrogen can play a very, very big role as that molecule which can replace the natural gas as a feedstock. So that's more on the industrial side, right? Now coming back to your question on AI, of course, everybody's interested in decarbonizing. Data centers have been on forefront of that they want to have green power. But here's the reality. Last year, Google's emission went up by 37%. It's in the public domain, right? Because the rate at which they have to build data centers, just to give you some numbers, last 5 years in United States, 55 gigawatts of electricity was consumed by data centers, 55 gigawatts. This year alone, already built or is being built is 41 gigawatts. So that is what we're talking in 1 year, okay? So they do want to decarbonize, but again, the question is going to be when is that green molecule available? And at the same time, infrastructure is ready or not? Is there a pipeline going to go to the data centers for hydrogen? Is there going to be a tanker which will take this hydrogen? So all those factors matter, right? But of course, there is a lot of interest in that. And one of the big reasons as Bloom, we make fuel cell also, which is totally fuel flexible. It can go from 100% natural gas to 100% hydrogen. It's like a dial. In between, you can mix. We have projects going on with SoCalGas as well. We can mix any amount of hydrogen in it. But it's the customer's choice that what fuel you want to use. In that sense, they like our technology a lot because they say, okay, at least it's future-proof. So I put the Bloom fuel cell, today I will use natural gas. 5 years down the road, when hydrogen becomes available, affordable, I can switch to hydrogen. But today I cannot name a single project where hydrogen is being used. And pilot scale probably yes. Commercial, I don't think there's any data center which is being powered by hydrogen today.
But in terms of like the companies that are interested in working with you on these, is that a lot of AI companies or data centers, or what are sort of the industries that you're, if not already serving, looking to?
So for us, Bloom fuel cell is basically, it's a fuel cell, it's a distributed generation, so you can put it outside your building, right? In fact, here in Southern California, Caltech is using Bloom fuel cell as well. The main customer, we have had a lot of data centers, hospitals, educational institutions, Home Depots, Walmarts of the world, right? And significant driver has been in the past has been my reliability and cost. Right now, the biggest interest is time to power. That we promise that we'll give you, after contract signing, we will install 50 to 100 megawatts within 6 months to a year, okay? That is one of the biggest drivers right now, time to power. Versus if you go to utilities, they'll tell you, I'll do 2 years of study before I can promise you anything, right? So and they don't have the, they don't want to wait. I mean, because the amount of money they lose on not running the data center is much higher than paying premium cost for premium power.
Thanks. Neil, where do you see the opportunities for hydrogen demand?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Darren.
Yeah, no worries. Just ribbing it a little bit. So I'm going to probably mention this a few times because it was 2.5 years of our life. This National Petroleum Council study. Please go take a look. It was 100 different companies, 200 different people. 30% of those were oil and gas. The rest were NGOs, educational. institutions and EPCs and such. So I want to frame this up. So I think the previous panel said, hey, there's no such thing as a free lunch. So let's talk about net zero for a second, and then I'll go back to the role of hydrogen. This NPC, we partnered with MIT, sorry, USC. My wife went to USC, but we partnered with MIT to do some modeling of the future energy. And when you said, what does it take for the US to get to net zero by 2050, right? It pulled in all the tools and all the costs. And from a total cost to society, it was about 3% of GDP. So if you kind of hold that thought for a second, 3% of GDP is the cost of society to transition from the economy that we have today to one that is at net zero. About $1 trillion a year is what it costs, right? So then you say, within that cost structure, where is hydrogen's role? So of all the emissions reductions, hydrogen played about an 8% role. Small but mighty is what I would say. I was feeling really good about that role, and someone said, well, that's not very much. But it's actually the hardest to abate sectors, right? The hardest to electrify sectors, like my colleagues have said, heavy duty trucking, dispatchable power, industrial, cement, steel, power. And so the point is to mitigate those emissions with hydrogen versus an alternative like direct air capture or something, you're saving the economy about 0.5% to 1%. And so I wanted to bring this all together. Yes, there's use cases, hard to abate, but hydrogen plays a role to abate certain sectors at a lower cost of society. 0.5% to 1% is roughly $160 to $260 billion a year. So anyway, I just wanted to help convey the message and the narrative that goes with me is, yes, there's a role, hardest to abate at a lower cost of society. So it's things like that I get really excited about the application for hydrogen.
Thanks. We've talked a little bit about this, but I think it'd be helpful to just go a little bit more into sort of the policies. So, there's the U.S. government, like many, but maybe not all around the world, has focused more on the production subsidies and the demand side for hydrogen. What kind of policies do you see as needed or expected down the road to jumpstart and scale this hydrogen economy, and what is the timeline here for making it competitive? Because it sounds like we all think it could become, but isn't yet. And so I know any day the IRA will put out its tax credit rule guidelines, which would last for 10 years. That subsidy, Ravi, is that going to help, or is more needed?
I think probably more is needed. I think there has to be demand side pull, right? Just to give an idea that, steel, for example, this is again my personal thought, that green steel, if there is some kind of incentive for using green steel, right? So there will be a significant interest in the steel industry that, hey, I will take the green hydrogen and I will use, instead of using today natural gas or coal, actually, to most of the steel comes from basically coal. You have coal and iron oxide that you mix together, and then you get iron, right? Instead of that, I will use green hydrogen and make green steel. There's another, in the previous panels, we have heard about domestic manufacturing, again, taking leadership in making green steel in the country, right? There could be other incentives attached to it, right? That would probably move the needle quite a bit. Then people are willing to pay even if the green hydrogen is not as cheap as everybody expected it to be, even after PTC, but you have another place where there's an incentive to say, okay, I'm still willing to take it, right? So I would think that definitely there is incentive required there. And finally, the infrastructure piece is still missing, right? End-to-end infrastructure. How are we going to move this molecule? That has to be thought through. And I hope one of those hubs, through these hubs, I was pretty involved in Archie's hub before I left and joined Bloom. Because Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, Adam Weber was the scientist, he's the CTO for Archie's. So I was very instrumental behind the thinking, right, at that time. And one of the things we used to talk about, that we have to look end to end. It can't be just about production, right? So infrastructure part is another part that should be thought about.
And that is part of Arches, right? Aren't they building pipelines? As
I said, I left 2 years ago. I have not. You can.
Yeah, they are. I think to your point, what are the policy? So the Biden administration, I think, did us all a favor and brought attention to hydrogen. I do think clarity around the 45B tax credits is essential, and nothing's going to move unless the tax credits are really understood and the rules of the game. The administration concentrated on production because I think that's where they knew where to start. You do need to understand what the overlying distribution and the market structure that underpins that distribution too. So we have hydrogen pipelines in the United States today. They're private party pipelines, which differs from, say, the energy sector, specifically natural gas, where you have open access, tariff-based rates to move natural gas and decoupling. And so those clarifications on policy, incentives on demand, clarity on the ability to move and permit infrastructure, I think those are really, really essential. Because there will be parts of the country where you can produce where you have access to cheap renewables for green hydrogen, where you have access to cheap natural gas and sequestration, where there may not be demand. And so you're going to have to move this hydrogen ultimately. The cheapest way to move molecules is generally in a pipeline, not in the back of a diesel truck, which is the way we move hydrogen today in large parts of the country. So those things, I think we need some clarity around this. The Europeans and in Southeast Asia, South Korea, Japan, but especially places like Netherlands are actively today building out common carrier hydrogen pipelines, replacing old natural gas pipelines, with the specific aim of creating a hydrogen economy where multiple producers, multiple consumers can all engage in a competitive market, clearly supported by the state.
And not to jump ahead, but what about like co-location of hydrogen production on the site so you don't have to worry about the...
Yeah, I mean, it's the nature of molecules, I think, that's important in storage. So ultimately, the value of a molecule is that you can store energy over time, differently than you can electricity. And so you do need access to storage over time. And co-location might work for some applications, but if you want to broadly, as a matter of sort of societal change, displace a lot of natural gas, you're going to have to use pipelines to do that.
Darren, do you have thoughts on the policies that are needed?
Yeah, maybe just a couple of anecdotes, I think, in terms of, first thing, we always talk about policy and how much more is needed. I'd say one thing is what the U.S. government did with the IRA was extraordinary, right? And it's great to incentivize production. I think part of the education, however, is to say thank you for that and helping this economy get activated. But if you kind of look and see the trajectory that the stated policy puts us on when it comes to net zero, with existing policies, I think it only gets us halfway to net zero is point one. That's part of the education. And so, I believe in a price in carbon. I think that's absolutely what you need. I know politically that's hard to do. To the degree, however, you try to encourage maybe a stepwise approach, whether it's like a LCFS type of program federally for transportation or for industry. I think it's a way to step into it. But ultimately, right, you need to value the carbon emissions for this to work. So without changes and added policy, you're not going to get there. And I think that you're talking about a 7-fold increase from, let's say today we produce 10 million tons per annum of high carbon hydrogen. You need to get to about 75 million of clean hydrogen to accomplish that 8% emissions reduction that we want, right? And with existing policy, you're not going to get very, very far. So you need that. The other thing I'd say is, getting back to infrastructure, and maybe we'll touch upon it later, to do what I think this economy needs for hydrogen scale, let's talk the US, you're talking trillions of dollars, maybe $2 trillion worth of capital you got to put in the ground. And so you also need permitting, right? You need codes and standards. You need to give investor assurance that things will get built and people know how to build them. So.
Okay, and so I guess kind of jumping off the permitting, California, like the country, has goals for hydrogen and is relying on it to meet its climate goals. But as with lots of different types of energy and energy permitting, there's a lot of disagreement between environmentalists and industry and labor over what building out the hydrogen economy should look like. So, should it be green versus other types? Is it just a few sectors or broad? I know, Neil, with SoCalGas, you had to scale back a blending project to blend hydrogen and natural gas pipelines, like a pilot at UC Irvine because of safety concerns. And then there's been lawsuits from environmental groups against all the utilities pursuing blending projects. There's also throughout the state, lawsuits against projects that would make hydrogen with ethanol or gray hydrogen at the ports more. So, when we've talked about on some of these other panels, like challenges with permitting and such, how do you weigh lawsuits and local opposition to things like blending projects or hydrogen production projects, or with biomass or gray or what have you, when you're thinking of what kind of projects to pursue?
Yeah, certainly a loaded question, but I'm happy to start. Two things. One is it is the current policy of the state, or baked into the policy documents of the state of California, is the use of hydrogen. In fact, the CARB scoping plan, CEC plans all contemplate essentially blending in the equivalent of 19% hydrogen into the natural gas system as one of the decarbonization vectors. I think translating that into projects that get built, just like any renewable project or any infrastructure project, is likely to meet some opposition. And it's also, I think, incumbent on the companies that are building this infrastructure to clearly describe where the benefits of these projects are going to accrue. So as an example, this idea of cleaner air closer to freeways where disadvantaged communities generally live in Central and Southern California. The idea that displacing diesel over time is something that if we delay that with lawsuits, we'll actually delay that benefit to those same communities. That's something that's not easily understood. And I do think there is a wide spectrum of support and opposition for these newer technologies, where they get cited, where do the benefits accrue. I would just say candidly, the EDFs of the world, Environmental Defense Fund, National Resources Defense Council, NRDC, they have very publicly supported the deployment of hydrogen, specifically in California, with the intent that it goes to support these same hard to electrify parts of the economy, and those benefits accrue to the communities that have been in the past impacted by the energy sector broadly. So, we are actually going to proceed. We have an application for a project at the UCI, another university a little further down the coast. But I think the idea of making sure that people understand what we intend to learn with those projects, and then ultimately what does it mean from a matter of policy of either blending hydrogen into the existing natural gas system or moving pure hydrogen as well. If we blended 20% hydrogen into the existing natural gas system in California, which is something that we believe we could do almost immediately, we could displace essentially 1.5 million cars from the road. That's the equivalent reduction in emissions. So, but making sure the communities understand and really understand where the benefits and the challenges are, I think that's going to take time, as it does with all these energy projects.
Do you have anything
Yeah,
to
if I
add?
could jump in. I mean, I think Neil mentioned this, right? Good for us, we talk about safety, we talk about risks, but then we forget to talk about benefits, right? Whether it's health benefits or what have you, which then leads me to kind of the trigger for me. It gets back to, so I previously said United States, $1.9 trillion worth of stuff that you need to put in the ground in order to get to this 8% emissions that hydrogen can mitigate. That's a lot of stuff, right? And I think that, I don't know, I heard you and I locked you in. You introduced me as an expert, so I'll take it.
Yeah.
But I really didn't know much about this 3 years ago. And so to the degree that I can walk in and lead strategy for hydrogen, thanks for the opportunity, knowing what I'm glad I didn't know what I didn't know 3 years ago, but I will take the fact that I actually know a lot now because I've had a lot of resources, I've had a lot of interactions within industry. So when you think about the community, societal considerations and impacts, these frontline communities where these things are going to get built, part of the issue is we got to mitigate the fact that we got to explain what this is. And it's taken me 3 years of intense time to understand the business case and understand what we're talking about. You got to engage with the community. They need to know who you are as industry. They need to know who government is. We need to know who they are. We need to tell them what this is, right? We need to train. We need to talk about the health benefits. We need to operate safely. Sometimes it feels like we don't have time to do that right, but we can't afford to not do that right. And I think that it's a way that we can rebase, some of the issues that some of these frontline impacted communities feel towards industry, right, by involving them in this next turn of the energy transition. So I think that's super important.
Ravi, do you have any thoughts on
I
that?
want to add a little bit another context. So if you look at, society today, we have 3 grids, right? We have the electron grid, the gasoline grid, and the natural gas grid. It offers energy security, resiliency in the world system, right? So at least I feel that it's very naive to think that everything will just connect to a wire and all the problems will get solved, right? The simplest I've seen, because of my experience in the national lab, also DOE and other places, that I also felt that the one sector of people, they believe that everything is available. There are 4 tools, I call it, in the toolbox: solar, wind, battery, and heat pumps. These things will solve every problem, okay? But there are it's much more complex than that, okay? We talked about base load power in the earlier sessions. In energy security, we talked about. Resiliency, we talked about. In California, in Northern California, 2 or 3 years ago, there was this wildfire in Shasta County, and quite a few people unfortunately died, right? But people who could leave because they had gasoline car, and they could start the car and get out of there, right? So there are other factors as well that needs to be thought through before saying that, hydrogen is bad or any kind of gas pipeline is bad. So those are the other elements that has to be part of the conversation.
Thanks. I do have a couple more questions here, but I'm cognizant that there's 12 minutes left on the clock, so I want to open it up first and see if there's anyone in the crowd that has hydrogen questions. There's one over there.
There you go. Thank you. First of all, this has nothing to do with my question, but I drove a hydrogen fuel cell car for 3 years, a Toyota Mirai, and I would say unhesitatingly it was the best driving experience I've ever had. And also, Toyota and the federal and state government make it really easy for you to do that. So if you need a new car, you should look into it. But that's not why I'm here. Darren, I'd like to ask you if you would tell the audience about the Intermountain Power Plant. It's a really interesting story about how it came about and what it was and what LADWP did and how it's doing right now.
Okay, I don't want to get out over my skis. Well, I'm the strategy guy. There's a lot that I don't know. But in a nutshell, right, you had a coal-fired power plant. It basically is getting converted into a natural gas-fired power plant, right? And so there's so many things, that you need to do. Chevron's philosophy, by the way, is not build it and they will come. Chevron's philosophy is go find a customer, understand what their problem is, solve their problem, and solve it with a solution. And so in this particular case, right, you have a customer in LADWP that has certain decarbonization goals and a certain willingness to pay. You have a coal-fired power plant that's converting, right? And then you have this coal-fired power plant that happens to sit on top of these salt domes, right? Ravi, the electrolyzer expert to my left, I think it's expensive to operate and you need to operate them, but at the end of the day, these salt domes right, allow you to contain hydrogen, this very small and slippery molecule, such that you can have super high utilization capacity factors, and that's the trick to keeping costs down. And so not only do you have a power plant that eventually will move from natural gas to co-firing with hydrogen to eventually just hydrogen firing, right? You're able to lower the cost probably by 20, 30% because you can keep these electrolyzers running, because when it's not needed, you can store in these salt domes underneath the ground. I think these 2 salt domes, each one is about the size of the Empire State Building. But just a fantastic example, you know, customer demand, policy enabled, right? Low cost. It just, hopefully that addresses some of the points. And yeah, just it's a hallmark project. So 2025 is when we'll be commissioning that, and exciting stuff.
This gentleman's comment about the Toyota Mirai also reminded me, because I know there's, I mean, it sounds like some people have a good experience. I know there's also a lawsuit against Toyota where customers are basically saying that they weren't able to fuel the car because there's just so few fueling stations. I know, Darren, you had some thoughts about, you know, perhaps light duty passenger car not being the, you know, best direction for hydrogen, but I don't, you know, thought.
Well, so I have a colleague, right, that drives a Toyota Mirai, and you look at the pump price, and it's like $32 a kilogram, which is quite expensive. But it works for now because it's policy enabled. I think, I don't know Toyota, but part of it is the Toyota Mirai and the subsidization of that experience allows you to drive it without feeling much consumer pain. But the point was trying to learn more about fueling and retail and dispensers and all that sort of stuff. So we'll see the future of light duty, right? I think light duty can make sense if you have a big hub in which you've got marginal hydrogen. But I also believe a very strong business case for heavy duty transportation, because if I have a Toyota Mirai, if I have an EV, which is the competition of a Toyota Mirai, right? It's like my range is pretty predictable, and I can come home and charge it overnight, and I don't care if it's not utilized. And if the car's a little bit heavier, so be it. Maybe my trunk's a little bit smaller, but I could still fit everything I wanted to. When you get into long haul or drayage or something like that, I care about range. And in order to go as far as I want, I have to carry a lot of batteries, so I can't carry as much stuff, and then I got to charge. And so you take this capacity hit, and you take this utilization hit. And while I don't care about my passenger car taking that hit, if I'm a driver, I absolutely care. And so that's where I think you start to have a hydrogen electric vehicle start to outcompete the pure economics of a battery electric heavy-duty vehicle, if that makes sense.
Any other questions in the crowd? There's someone over there.
Thank you for being with us here today. My name is Edric. I'm a second-year MBA student. So my question is, we know certain countries in areas with abundance of sunlight and renewables like Chile, Australia, they could produce lower cost of green hydrogen. So how is it for U.S. companies and U.S.-based production to compete with those countries? And what's your take on imports? Thank you.
Yeah, actually, that's a very good point. In fact, I've just, last week I was in Morocco for a Power 2X conference. And I did not know till I went to Morocco, my colleague who is a commercial guy for Bloom, he said, Ravi, you have to come to Morocco. So it's amazing. That country has solar and wind combination, capacity factor is 70%. And the electricity, green electricity is available for as low as 2 cents per kilowatt hour. And its proximity to Europe, where there's significant demand for fuel, you can actually take a boat and go to Spain from Morocco in 36 minutes, right? So that country is going all for hydrogen and not for themselves, for exporting, right? So in this sense, I would say for the US companies, it's not only important that you create the hydrogen here, it's also important that our technology gets deployed outside of United States, whether be it Chile, be it Australia, be it Morocco, right? And then, because it's about the technology called electrolyzer if you're doing green hydrogen. So I think it's in that sense great for United States that our green electrolyzer technology get deployed in the rest of the world, and then how the fuel get traded and between which country, that's a different question. Maybe it will come back to the United States as well, but for US, you have another source of zero carbon hydrogen, which is blue hydrogen, because from natural gas. Other countries are not lucky, like they don't have those resources. So whether we will be importing hydrogen from outside, that is a very big question. But we should definitely be exporting or putting America-made technology in the rest of the world where they are going after green hydrogen.
Do you guys want to add anything to that, or?
I think the other thing, so certainly, there are announced projects in Chile. You have to consider sort of transportation costs as you look at that, and then what form. I think Darren mentioned the production of ammonia as a potential. So if you produce green ammonia with green hydrogen, as an example, and then you want to use it in the U.S. as hydrogen, you have to dissociate it and separate the nitrogen. So there's a cost penalty to that. One of my colleagues, Dr. Yuri Friedman, often says, problems are usually costs in disguise. And so it all comes down to a lot to not just efficiency, but cost. How much is this going to cost the consumer, either in the aggregate, so the levelized cost of the energy, but also on the coldest of cold nights when you still need to keep the heat on, the lights on, or on a very, very hot day in Los Angeles or Palm Springs where it's 120 degrees Fahrenheit, that's 53 degrees Celsius or thereabouts. Those are key life issues that require life-sustaining access to energy. And we need to think about the fact that it's the tail risk. For all the folks all the MBA students have taken a lot of statistics. It's the tail of the risk that you have to also think about as you think about energy.
Any other questions? Oh, there's someone over there.
Yeah, I think it's working now. My name is Calvin. I'm a first-year MBA student. So there's a lot of use for hydrogen in heavy transportation industry. I was hoping we could discuss any other use cases for green hydrogen, especially for industrial applications.
Question is other uses?
Other uses, we talked a bit about other uses, but just a little more in depth about other uses besides transportation for green hydrogen.
So I'm happy to keep it quick. I mean, I think getting back to what's the right use case, I'll say once again, hard to abate. So whether it's heavy duty transportation or dispatchable power or industrial use, like decarbonizing chemical production and refineries, steel, things like that. And once again, we talk about blue and green, different carbon intensities, different costs. I just want to reiterate, in my view, this isn't a competition between blue and green. This is about using all the tools you can. And if blue scales first, start using it now. If green scales later, start using it when it scales. And the point is that we are on the clock, and anything you do that mitigates a CO2 today is worth a lot more than that same CO2 mitigated tomorrow. And so by 2050, will green become a bit more dominant? For sure, right? But please don't wait to start taking action. So thank you for the question. It just triggers this notion of you got to use all tools, and we got to start now, right?
But the most, right now, almost all the project which has been announced or MOE has been signed mostly for ammonia. Okay, that's where most of the interest has been seen, and primary reason is because ammonia is a very good hydrogen carrier, and then downstream, ammonia can be probably used directly in the shipping industry as well as a fuel, or ammonia is used for fertilizers, or it can be used, even in power plants. You can directly inject ammonia with coal, but so most of the announcement I have seen is basically using hydrogen to make ammonia.
Maybe just one last thing. I'll plug in for Darren's study, so this was the National Petroleum Council. That's a bit of a misnomer because it's really an energy council to the Secretary of Energy. So this group of about 200 organizations or thereabouts included major environmental entities like EDF NRDC. So this is not oil companies per se. This is many, many, many NGOs that were involved in this study, and DOE scientists, MIT, and others. It really is worth a few minutes of your time to review this, the first 10, 20 pages of the study. It took 3 years to put this together. A lot of consensus work by parties that really started the study with very different ideas of where it would go. And it is worth your time to read it for as bedtime reading. It will put you to sleep eventually, though.
Yeah, and I'll just react. One of the learnings I had is, just to all of you, and most of you know it, maybe the students just a plug. It's like, it's easy to stay insular to your company and try to fight the fight. And this is an example of where there's a lot of people in government that want to do the right thing. They just don't know who to answer. And so when you have a product in which there's huge diversity, it makes it easier for people to understand the right thing so they don't question, ancillary motivations. So get out of your companies and collaborate, right, with others is a key takeaway. So.
We're past time, so thanks everyone. That's the hydrogen panel.